Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome back to English with Jack. My goal with this channel is to help you move beyond simple textbook exercises and start understanding English as it is spoken in the real world. Today, we are going to improve your listening skills with a story titled The Vintage Project. By following this narrative, you will learn how to use specific idioms regarding money and cost, while also picking up some useful British vocabulary related to cars and hobbies. Arthur had always dreamed of owning a classic British sports car. He spent his weekends browsing websites and reading magazines about vintage motors, imagining himself driving through the countryside with the wind in his hair. He lived in a small flat in the centre of Manchester, which meant he did not have a garage, but that minor detail never stopped his dreaming. One rainy Tuesday, whilst scrolling through an online marketplace, he saw it. It was a 1970s convertible, painted in a faded British racing green. The description was honest, admitting that the vehicle needed some tender, loving care, but the price seemed reasonable. Arthur immediately rang his best friend George, who knew a thing or two about mechanics. George was skeptical, but he agreed to drive Arthur to the seller's house in the Peak District to have a look. When they arrived at the address, the rain was pouring down, creating puddles on the gravel driveway. The car was sitting under a tarpaulin in the garden. The seller, an elderly man named Mr. Higgins, came out to greet them and pulled back the cover. The car looked much worse than it had in the photographs. The paint was peeling, one of the wing mirrors was hanging off, and the tires were completely flat. George walked around the vehicle, kicking the tires and shaking his head. He opened the bonnet and stared at the engine for a long time. He turned to Arthur and whispered that the engine block was rusty and the gearbox looked seized. He warned Arthur that getting this car back on the road would not be cheap. In fact, George was certain that the repairs would cost an arm and a leg. However, Arthur was already in love. He ignored the warning signs, shook Mr. Higgins' hand, and transferred the money right there on the spot. He had just bought himself a very expensive hobby. Getting the vehicle back to Manchester was an adventure in itself. Since the engine refused to start, Arthur had to hire a recovery lorry to transport his new prize. The driver was a cheerful man who joked that the rust was the only thing holding the metal together. Arthur laughed politely, but he was starting to feel a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had rented a small lock-up garage near the motorway because there was no space for the car at his block of flats. Once the car was safely inside the garage, the real work began. Arthur bought a set of spanners, some overalls, and a large manual on classic car restoration. He felt ready to tackle the project, convinced that a bit of elbow grease was all that was needed to make the car shine again. However, the reality of restoring a 40-year-old vehicle soon set in. Every time he removed a part, he discovered another problem hiding underneath. When he took off the bumper, he found that the metal frame was rotten. When he lifted the carpets in the footwell, he could see the concrete floor of the garage through a hole in the chassis. He spent his evenings scouring the internet for spare parts. To his horror, original components for this specific model were incredibly rare and expensive. A new exhaust system cost hundreds of pounds, and he had to import a replacement windscreen from a specialist in Germany. The costs were spiralling out of control, far beyond his initial budget. George visited the lockup one Saturday to see how things were progressing. He found Arthur sitting on an old tyre, looking exhausted and covered in oil.
Arthur admitted that he had already spent half of his savings and the engine was still in pieces on the workbench. George looked at the invoice for the leather upholstery Arthur had ordered. He raised an eyebrow and told his friend that he was bleeding money. Arthur sighed deeply, realizing that George had been right from the start. This was not just a restoration, it was a financial black hole. Yet he could not bring himself to give up now. He had invested too much time and emotion into the project to let the car beat him.
6 months later, the moment of truth finally arrived. Arthur had paid a professional mechanic to rebuild the carburetor, which was the final piece of the puzzle. The car passed its MOT test on the first attempt, much to everyone's surprise. The faded green paint had been polished until it gleamed, and the chrome bumpers sparkled in the spring sunshine. It was time for the maiden voyage. Arthur invited George to join him for a spin through the countryside. As they pulled out of the garage, the engine purred beautifully, a deep and throaty sound that turned heads as they drove down the high street. They drove out of Manchester and on to the winding roads of the Peak District. The roof was down and the air was crisp. The car handled the corners surprisingly well, although the suspension was a little stiff. They stopped at a traditional country pub for a celebratory lunch. As they admired the vehicle parked outside, George patted Arthur on the back. He admitted that the car looked magnificent, a true classic. He asked Arthur if he had any regrets about the project. Arthur looked at his gleaming car and then checked his banking app on his mobile phone. He smiled wryly and admitted that while the car was a dream come true, the restoration had indeed cost an arm and a leg. In fact, he had spent so much money on the car that he had to ask George to pay for the lunch.
And that brings us to the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed following Arthur's expensive journey to restore his classic car and George's practical advice along the way. Notice how we used specific vocabulary related to money and value, such as cost an arm and a leg and reasonable, to describe the financial impact of his hobby. It is a great way to talk about prices that are very high in a natural, conversational way. If you found this lesson useful, please do hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. See you in the next lesson.